What's going on, guys? Dare here with Fantasy Football Advice, coming at you with another fantasy football video. Today, the first week of NFL action is coming to a close, and with that, we do have to prepare ourselves for the waiver wire for the upcoming week. With it being the first real waiver wire action we'll have for the season, the waiver wire is full of gems at all positions. We'll get into exactly who those players are, how much fab we think that you guys should invest into them. But before we do, I have a public service announcement for all of you guys out there. It's just week one. Don't overreact. If some of your players did underperform, or maybe even some of your players were overperformers, there's no need to overreact to one singular bad performance in week one, especially where offenses and defenses can be a bit wonky. Even in past seasons, comparing week one to the remainder of the season, we always have wonky performances at this stage of the season, so there's no need to drop a player that you invested heavily into on draft day simply due to one bad performance. With that being said, guys, we're going to hop right into the waiver ads. Let's just hit on the stat of the day first. Yesterday's stat of the day was which wide receiver had the second most half PPR points in this preseason. The correct answer was Marquez Callaway. Congratulations to Caps for the Cup, the first to get this right on YouTube, and as for Twitter, at mtager3211. Once again, congratulations to both of you, but let's see who can get today's stat of the day right. Through Sunday, which running back currently leads the league in the area of rushing yards? Keep in mind that's through Sunday, so we're only going to count the games on Thursday and Sunday combined. And once again, that question is which running back currently leads the league in the area of rushing yards? If you think you know who that player is, leave your answer in the comment section down below. We'll be happy to let you know who wins in tomorrow's video. Without further ado though, let's hop right into one of the most exciting parts about fantasy football, upgrading our roster. That's right, we're talking about the waiver wire. We will begin with arguably the most important position, the running back position. And up on your screen, you're going to see 8 running backs that I think you should consider adding this week. Obviously, the more lower tier additions we have at the bottom of this list, they may not be as strong as the running back you do have on the bench, and we'll kind of go into the range at which I think that we can project these players out for the remainder of the season, so you can make that judgment call as to whether you want to drop your bench running back for this player. But we're starting up at the top at a blockbuster running back that you can get off of the waiver wire that we suggest investing heavily into. That player, Elijah Mitchell of the San Francisco 49ers. And we thought heading into this matchup that we could expect a combination of Trey Sermon and Raheem Mostert to soak up most of the touches out of the backfield for this team in this week one matchup. It was surprising to hear that Trey Sermon was actually listed as a healthy scratch heading into this week. That, of course, being a situation that we are going to want to monitor. But another surprising thing was Elijah Mitchell, a running back also drafted like Trey Sermon in this year's draft class. The only difference was the team invested a 6th-round draft pick into him. Trey Sermon, of course, drafted 3 rounds higher in the 3rd round. Comparing the draft capital amongst both of those players, you would assume Trey Sermon to be the starter in this situation and Elijah Mitchell to be the healthy scratch, but it was actually in reverse, and Elijah Mitchell actually put together a surprising week 1 performance. He received a massive workload, 19 touches on the ground. With those 19 carries, he put together 104 rushing yards, even scoring a rushing touchdown as well. And although the matchup against the Detroit Lions is one of the best we could possibly ask for, with Raheem Mostert being now placed on IR, this is a great opportunity for Elijah Mitchell to make a name for himself in the next coming weeks. And I'd say due to how well he did perform, even with Trey Sermon playing presumably next week, I would give the favorite, and in the rankings, likely Elijah Mitchell will be the favorite when it comes to the week 2 rankings. For that, we recommend using your highest waiver priority on Elijah Mitchell. Our fab suggestion would also be around 30%. Moving into the next running back though, we have Tony Jones Jr., the backup for the New Orleans Saints. Adding Tony Jones Jr. off the waiver wire is investing into the Latavius Murray role, that dual role that plays a great handcuff if anything does happen to Alvin Kamara. You're talking a borderline top 10, pushing top 5 running back if Tony Jones Jr. can perform as well as he reportedly has been. A perfect segue into the second most important factor that would motivate me to grab him off the waiver wire is that Tony Jones Jr. is actually looking good. Of course, all reports we've had out of camp were that Tony Jones Jr. was defeating Latavius Murray in a running back competition. Latavius Murray, a running back that really doesn't wow us on film or on paper, but he's always been a guy that has been typically playing above average, never competing with the league leaders in most categories, but he does a lot of things very well. With Tony Jones Jr. playing well enough to usurp him, that really goes a long way in telling us how strong and capable this young running back really is. Now, although he did get 11 touches in this contest, we must take that with a grain of salt. He had 11 carries for 50 rushing yards. He had 1 reception for another 3 receiving yards, making his total 12 touches for 53 total yards. But like I said, grain of salt, 4 of his rush attempts were in succession of one another to close out this game after they were up 28 points. So back-to-back rush attempt. That's just not going to be the type of volume we can rely on to consistently come his direction week in, week out, because how many games are they going to be up 28 points at the very end of the game? I know the Packers are a strong team, but just something you you shouldn't really count on. For that reason, I don't think he's really someone you can trust in the flex while Alvin Kamara is starting, but if anything were to happen to him, you have yourself an RB1. Let's move into the next running back, and we can kind of fly through these. Kenneth Gainwell, back up for the Philadelphia Eagles. He put in a solid performance, receiving 11 touches himself, 9 carries, 2 receptions. With those 9 carries, he averaged 4.1 yards per carry, coming in with 37 total yards, but was able to score a rushing touchdown through the air. Not very efficient, only 6 receiving yards on his 2 receptions, but it was good to still see him used in that area. Right now, he's battling Boston Scott for his position on the depth chart, and I think his performance in this week, there's a strong case to be made for him to be the front runner, to be the clear backup behind Miles Sanders. That right there could be a very valuable role because it looks like Jalen Hurts and this offense could be a little bit better than many of us, myself included, expected them to be throughout this offseason. Behind him, another valuable handcuff that we should be targeting is Carlos Hyde. One of the issues with handcuffs is we may be actually rostering these players for the entire season, believing that they are the handcuff behind the stud running back. So if anything were to happen to that stud running back, our handcuff would presumably just step in and soak up the majority of that lost production. Well, unfortunately, oftentimes we may think we know who the backup is, but when it comes down to it, we really don't. And Carlos Hyde, he's one of the rare handcuffs that we can guarantee is going to step in if anything were to happen to James Robinson. And while it's not going to be the most valuable role to have handcuffed, that being the role of the running back in the Jacksonville Jaguars offense, it's still a lead running back in an offense that does have some upside to it. A low floor, I would say, but still does have the upside. And looking at Carlos Hyde's week 1 performance, not only did he get carries on the ground where he received 9 of them, but he also had 2 receptions, put in a respectable 14 receiving yards. So that does indicate to us if anything were to happen to James Robinson and Carlos Hyde does step in, Hyde would not only be getting those rush attempts on the ground, but also be worked in through some receptions through the air. That's a bit different than what we had seen from him throughout his entire career. So a very positive note working in his benefit. Behind him, Cordarelle Patterson, who is listed as a running back, but he's one of those gadget players who can line up as wide receiver, as running back as well. And in this game this past weekend on the Atlanta Falcons against the Philadelphia Eagles, he received 7 carries, showing off his effectiveness, translating those 7 carries to 54 rushing yards, had some work in the receiving game, 2 receptions, 13 receiving yards. So all around, a pretty strong game and a pretty strong performance for Cordarelle Patterson. What I will say though is that not every matchup is going to be against the Philadelphia Eagles, and his role specifically being a gadget player that you can play out of the backfield, that is going to be the Achilles heel of the Philadelphia Eagles defense. So don't expect him to be as involved or as effective in other matchups. The question we have to ask ourselves though is more how much volume will he receive week to week? And from the looks of it, the Atlanta Falcons are lacking playmakers. So I do believe that if he's able to step up, especially as he had in week 1, he's going to work himself into even more opportunities. And with this week 1 performance under his belt, I think week 2, he will at least get an opportunity to see a similar type of workload. Up next, guys, James White, he's back, baby. And with Mac Jones being the starter, James White and his value is going to be much higher than it was with Cam Newton starting. Obviously, though, it's James White. We know what we're getting out of him, so he's going to be more of a high floor player, but that floor we do have to understand is not going to be as high as it was with Brady under center and their chemistry that they had built over many seasons. But James White does have a role. It's a very useful role in this offense, and the way that Mac Jones did use him, it does seem as though he will be playing as more of an outlet, something that can certainly help a young, inexperienced quarterback gain some confidence and put together some sustained drive. Behind him, we have Mark Ingram of the Houston Texans. I think a lot of people are going to have Ingram much higher, but this all comes down to the not overreacting to week 1 type situation. First of all, the Houston Texans are not going to be facing the Jacksonville Jaguars each and every week. And in fact, the Houston Texans, heading into most matchups, much like they were this week, they're not going to be favorites. Believe it or not, the Jacksonville Jaguars were 3-point favorites in this matchup with a rookie quarterback in a game where they were playing at home. Now, they did perform well, but that doesn't mean heading into their next matchup, they're instantly going to be favorites. No, they performed well, so didn't Mark Ingram, but this is going to be one of those situations where you're going to want your league mates investing all of their fab, investing all of their waiver priority into this player while you sit back and move up those waiver rankings. All right, the final running back we have Larry Rountree of the LA Chargers, and for this one, it's not going to be somebody you're going to want to invest your fab into or a high waiver claim. If you do have a sizable high waiver claim, I wouldn't even put a waiver in for him. In fact, I would try to see if waivers clear and you can add him as a free agent. Reason being is that he is the best backup for the LA Chargers. Austin Eckler also a bit injured. He was noted as having a hamstring injury. A hamstring injury is what held him out for 6 games in 2020. So there's a solid chance that Austin Eckler does miss some time at the early portion of the season, and in those games, Larry Rountree is going to be the backup. For that, he is going to be worth an add, but don't invest too much waiver priority into him or too much of your fab into him, because there's definitely going to be better players that you can get off the waivers in the next coming weeks. Alright guys, we're moving over to the wide receiver position, and I think there is a good opportunity to get a lot of really good wide receivers off the waiver wire this week, ones you can even put in as early as next week. Up at the top, none other than Sterling Shepard of the New York Giants. He's coming off a game where he had a monster performance, 7 receptions, 113 receiving yards, even scored a receiving touchdown. That was on the back of 9 targets, so he certainly made the most out of his targets, but heading into next week, we could possibly expect him to see a similar type of target market share. Unfortunately for him, he is on a team that has a ton of weapons, maybe not elite options, but Kenny Galladay is there. He was playing in this week's matchup. Evan Ingram, he was injured, but expect to see more of him in the coming weeks. So for that, Sterling Shepard, while having a knockout performance, may not be a knockout you can trust each and every week, but he certainly is going to be one of the higher players on our rankings, certainly in flex conversation each and every week, and for us to be able to get that off the waiver wire, it's pretty darn valuable after week 1. Next, Tim Patrick. A very similar situation can be said about him on a team with a lot of weapons. Tim Patrick, though, I would give him less of a chance of actually having season-long sustained performances like this, because when it comes to Sterling Shepard, he has built up and developed that chemistry over years with Daniel Jones. Now, keep in mind, Jerry Jeudy is expected to miss some time with an injury. At this point, we don't know exactly how much time that is, but that is going to open up opportunities for another wide receiver in this offense to step up and soak up some of the production while he is out. At this time, we don't know exactly how long that is going to be, but in the meantime, you can try to wring out some production from him. He is the most likely candidate to see additional targets in his absence. Alright guys, the next player may be a bit of a curveball for you. It's Cedrick Wilson of the Dallas Cowboys, and this is largely on the back of the injury to Michael Gallup that ended up landing him on IR. For that, with Michael Gallup being out for a significant amount of time, that's going to open up more opportunities for other receivers outside of Amari Cooper and CeeDee Lamb. Gallup himself was already a player that you could have trusted to start. Cedrick Wilson, while we will want to see a bit more from him, he is going to likely be that next receiver up in this offense. He's coming off of a performance where he had 3 targets, catching all 3 of them for 24 receiving yards, no touchdown or anything, but it does show promise into what we could potentially expect from him in the future. Alright guys, moving into the next player, we're bouncing back to the Denver Broncos. It's KJ Hamler. This is largely to the same narrative of Jerry Jeudy, potentially missing a significant amount of time, and any weeks that he does miss, another wide receiver is going to have to step up in his place, and with that comes additional targets and potentially a player that could be valuable for fantasy. Tim Patrick would obviously be our first choice on the Denver Broncos receivers for the most likely to step up in his place, but KJ Hamler is certainly a player that could see an uptick as well. I would say KJ Hamler on a per target basis is a pretty strong player, so any uptick in volume is going to directly translate to fantasy points, so KJ Hamler certainly should be on your radar, and for that we think he should be added off the waiver wire, but you may not be forced to put in a waiver claim in order to nab him. Alright guys, moving into the next player, it's going to be a combination of Rondale Moore and Christian Kirk, both 2 players that do deserve your attention off the waiver wire, who put in strong performances in a game in which Kyler Murray just popped off completely, played lights out, and the result is 2 of your players that were afterthoughts for most people in drafts are now going to be some of the hottest ads off the waiver wire. Rondale Moore, the less productive of the 2, did receive 5 targets, converting that into 4 receptions for 68 receiving yards. Christian Kirk, however, went bananas with the same amount of targets, 5 total, but he caught all 5 of them for 70 receiving yards and even scored 2 receiving touchdowns. If Kyler Murray continues to play like a stud, both of these receivers will be ranked high in the rankings. Think back to seasons like the LA Rams have had in the past with Brandon Cooks, Robert Woods, and Cooper Kupp all being valuable fantasy assets. This is something we could potentially see because Kyler Murray, so far from what we've seen, when he likes to target players, he likes to target the wide receiver position deep and down the field. For that, we think both these players should be added off of the waivers. You may not need to invest a waiver claim to do that, but after the way that everyone saw Kyler Murray perform in week 1, in order to make sure you do land one of these players, a waiver claim may be required. If you're looking for additional possible players to get off the waiver wire, you can always check out our website. That's thefantasyfootballadvice.com. The link for that is in the description. But for now, we're going to be going over to the quarterbacks and the tight ends. We only have two quarterbacks this week. It's Jameis Winston and Taylor Heinicke. And starting up at the top, we have Jameis Winston, who's coming off of a phenomenal performance himself on a mere 20 total pass attempts. Against the Green Bay Packers, Jameis Winston converted those 20 pass attempts into 14 completions for a mere 148 receiving yards. But what was phenomenal about it was that he threw for 5 touchdowns. Long gone are the days where Jameis Winston needs to throw 5,000 passing yards to get 30 touchdowns. He did 1/6 of that in 1 week with a mere 148 passing yards. For that, we think that he should be added off waivers by QB needy teams. That's not to say that his efficiency will be anywhere near this high in other games. As mentioned, we don't overreact in week 1, but he is still on a strong team with playmakers in several positions. And in my opinion, the team is very well coached, so Jameis Winston definitely deserves an add for teams that need a quarterback this week. Alright guys, we're moving into Taylor Heinicke of the Washington football team, and unfortunately, Ryan Fitzpatrick has landed himself on IR. In his place, Taylor Heinicke is looking to step up, and from what we saw from him at the tail end of last season, and even in this game against the LA Chargers, there is a decent amount to look forward to with him being the starter for the future. In this game, he attempted 15 passes, completed 11 of them for a 73% completion rate. In the area of touchdowns, he threw 1, no interceptions, so it appears that he is going to be a serviceable quarterback, but from what we've seen from him in the past, there certainly is some upside to go along with it. Like the New Orleans Saints, the Washington football team is full of playmakers. You have Terry McLaurin, Antonio Gibson, Curtis Samuel will be returning at some point in the near future. And if some of you are in deeper leagues, 2 quarterback leagues, or maybe everybody in your 12-man league drafts 2 to 3 quarterbacks, Taylor Heinicke is definitely an upside guy you can add to your bench. Alright guys, we're moving into the tight end position, and quite frankly, we are going to have better weeks for tight end in the future, but we do have one player that we were pretty high on throughout this draft process. I think you all know where this is heading. It's Kmet of the Chicago Bears. He's coming off of a game in which he received 7 targets, caught 5 of them for 42 receiving yards. And if you followed our analysis throughout the offseason, or even were following his production throughout the tail end of last season, Kmet was a receiver who was receiving this type of volume at the tail end of last year, consistently week in, week out. So starting off this season with this amount of targets, it really doesn't surprise us, or it shouldn't. His yardage also being on the lower end is something that we had seen consistently as well. So don't expect him to be a high yardage guy, but we're hoping he can increase some of his red zone volume as well. Combining this type of PPR value with the potential of a touchdown in future games means he's going to be a guy in conversations each and every week to be starting. For that, he should not be on waiver wire. So if Kmet is out there and you need a tight end, look his direction. He's the top on our list. Behind him, we have Juwan Johnson of the New Orleans Saints. As you know, we were pretty high on Adam Troutman throughout this past offseason, but with him being injured, we took him off of our targets list, but we know that the New Orleans Saints always love to target tight ends. That's regardless of if Drew Brees is starting. Jameis Winston in the red zone certainly looked in his direction, although he only had 3 total targets on the game. That's Juwan Johnson, of course, we're speaking on. He caught all of them, 2 of them even going for touchdowns. So in this game where he only received 3 targets, he put up over 17 half-point PPR fantasy points. So definitely a guy that we're going to want to add if tight end is a position of need for our team. Now after that, we do have a couple of dart throws in James O'Shaughnessy and Tyler Conklin. Starting with James O'Shaughnessy, it was a phenomenal matchup being against the Houston Texans, but anyone receiving these types of targets, we're talking 8 here at the tight end position, they definitely deserve to be on our radar whether you add them or not. James O'Shaughnessy, I do see a lot of people avoiding just due to the fact that he is on the Jacksonville Jaguars. There are a lot of mouths to feed in that offense, but with 8 targets comes 6 receptions, 48 receiving yards, so a very Kmet type performance, but the only difference is Kmet's somebody who has consistently proven to us to be able to garner this type of target market share. James O'Shaughnessy, he certainly could be a one-week wonder. As for Tyler Conklin taking over for the injured and currently on IR, Irv Smith Jr., who is looking to take the place of Kyle Rudolph, the longtime tight end for the Minnesota Vikings, who had since moved away in free agency, and Tyler Conklin in his first game produced fairly well. He only did receive 4 targets though, but did catch all 4 of them for 41 yards, and as mentioned, Irv Smith Jr. is currently on the IR, so he is going to get at least a few more opportunities to try and prove himself, as Irv Smith is unable to take the field, and for that is going to be a position that we do see value from. We have in years past, as mentioned, with Kyle Rudolph and also Irv Smith towards the tail end of last season, and while this is likely going to be more of a short-term rental and a dart throw at best, with the position being as thin as it is, from what we've seen from Conklin, he does deserve a speculative add. For more waiver additions, definitely check out our website. That's thefantasyfootballadvice.com. The link for that's in the description box below. But guys, that's going to do it for this video. We really hoped you enjoyed. If you did, how about hitting that like button? If you're new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button. Thank you all for watching. Catch you on the next one.